This morning, an unredacted transcript from a closed-door briefing in the White House Situation Room landed on my desk, confirming that the apparent policy shift regarding North American trade was not a planned realignment. Yesterday, the President of the United States stood before the press corps and read an unedited 812-word statement that dismantled his administration's entire 18-month economic strategy against America's northern neighbor. That specific sequence of events reveals a sudden shift in policy rather than a negotiated compromise. The background of this public reversal is rooted in a timeline that began 18 months ago with the imposition of sweeping tariffs on Canadian imports, aimed at forcing a renegotiation of resource access. Over the course of the confrontation, the administration applied sustained economic pressure, including a $350 billion uranium ultimatum and targeted sanctions on base metals. The strategy targeted Canadian ports, copper prices, and demanded institutional leadership changes in Ottawa, operating on the assumption that asymmetric economic size would guarantee a rapid diplomatic concession. That structural assumption collapsed over a 12-hour period when the domestic costs of the confrontation generated a coordinated challenge from within the United States cabinet. The immediate trigger for the policy reversal was the passage of a law in the Canadian House of Commons that established the Canadian Strategic Resource Authority, or CSRA. That legislation passed unanimously with a vote of 38-0, placing all vital raw material exports, including oil, natural gas, uranium, copper, and lithium, under a single institutional structure empowered to regulate buyers and set export conditions. Within 90 minutes of the announcement, commodity markets reacted significantly, with West Texas Intermediate rising by 6%, natural gas futures spiking by 11%, and uranium spot prices increasing by 9%. That sharp market reaction created an immediate transmission mechanism that brought the strategic vulnerabilities of the United States supply chain directly into domestic financial markets, causing the S&P 500 to decline by nearly 3% in a single trading session. What that market shift did structurally was force an immediate re-evaluation of risk premiums across every manufacturing and energy sector exposed to Canadian raw materials. This resource strategy landed on top of an accumulation of economic friction that had been building across the United States economy for over a year and a half. The tariffs had already generated an estimated $47 billion in higher costs for American consumers, impacting sectors from housing construction due to timber prices to automotive manufacturing. 7 northern border states, including Michigan, New York, and Maine, were forced to activate energy reserve protocols as natural gas prices in the Midwest doubled, and heating oil futures reached a 10-year high. That regional energy duress began to manifest as an immediate threat to domestic stability, as grid operators warned of potential winter blackouts during peak loads. This evidence indicates that the economic insulation the administration expected to protect the domestic market had worn through before the winter heating season even began. The systemic friction extended into transport and logistics, where the disruption of bilateral frameworks created operational vacuums along the 5,500-mile border. The closure of specific transit paths and airspace restrictions resulted in a documented cost of more than $3 billion annually for domestic aviation due to commercial rerouting. The reallocation of Canadian port capacity away from traditional American Midwestern supply chains toward European and Asian markets through long-term contracts permanently altered maritime logistics. That shift meant that even a sudden resolution of the immediate trade dispute would not automatically return shipping capacity to American hubs. This reality altered the long-term calculations of commercial logisticians, who began shifting data centers and processing facilities across the border to ensure operational continuity. The critical turning point occurred when the economic data intersected directly with military readiness and legislative projections during a scheduled 90-minute cabinet meeting that extended to 5 hours. The Secretary of the Treasury presented a classified assessment showing a projected 1.4% contraction in first-quarter economic output if the CSRA restrictions remained active through the winter. That finding was compounded by a presentation from the Secretary of Defense, who informed the National Security Team that the interruption of Canadian uranium supplies directly compromised the fuel chain for naval reactors and the wider nuclear deterrent. The explicit statement from the Pentagon that it could no longer certify to Congress that military readiness was unaffected removed the policy from the realm of standard trade negotiation. That intervention shifted the internal debate from a question of economic endurance to an immediate national security vulnerability that the administration could not, legally or operationally, defend. The political calculation was finalized when electoral analysts provided data showing that the confrontation had become the primary concern for swing state voters ahead of the midterm elections. Projections indicated that the combination of energy rationing in New England, manufacturing layoffs in the Midwest, and rising consumer prices risked the loss of both chambers of Congress. That assessment made it clear that the executive branch no longer possessed the domestic political capital required to maintain an escalatory posture through the winter months. The decision to accept the Canadian framework, which emphasizes sovereign control over resources, was made within minutes of that political briefing. What this reversal means for the international system is that a middle power successfully utilized targeted resource institutionalization to neutralize the economic leverage of a larger state. But a more consequential question remains regarding how this shift alters the long-term strategic posture of the United States across other bilateral relationships. Was the vulnerabilities exposed in Washington primarily a function of dependence on Canadian industrial inputs, or does it signal a broader limitation in the utility of unilateral economic pressure within integrated supply chains? The sudden reversal at the White House podium exposed a fundamental structural vulnerability in how a major power exercises economic leverage over an integrated neighbor. While the immediate trigger was a domestic political and national security crisis within the United States cabinet, the underlying mechanics of that capitulation require a closer examination of how a smaller economy systematically dismantled a superior power's options. This was not an ad hoc defensive reaction by Ottawa. It was a calibrated execution of resource statecraft that targeted specific vulnerabilities in the American industrial base over an 18-month timeline. To understand how a middle power forced an unconditional retreat without firing a shot or offering a single concession, it is necessary to examine the hidden layers of the Canadian counter-strategy. The first strategic layer involves the deliberate timing and legal structure of the Canadian Strategic Resource Authority. When the law passed the Canadian Parliament with a unanimous 338-0 vote, it did not target American companies by name, nor did it implement explicit export bans. Instead, the statute quietly reclassified all critical raw materials as assets of national security, subject to a federal review process that evaluated the host nation's regulatory stability. That legal phrasing meant that any country imposing arbitrary tariffs or sanctions on Canada automatically failed the security evaluation, triggering a suspension of long-term supply contracts. That mechanism is significant because it shifted the burden of escalation entirely onto the United States legal system. By making the resource cutoff an automatic consequence of American tariff policy, Ottawa insulated itself from charges of violating international trade rules while forcing American corporations to lobby their own government for relief. The economic data from the energy sector illustrates exactly how quickly this legal trap closed on the industrial Midwest. In the first 60 days following the establishment of the CSCSA, crude oil deliveries through the Enbridge pipeline network to refineries in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois declined by 14% under the new security compliance protocols. Simultaneously, electricity exports from Hydro-Quebec to New York and New England dropped by 22% as Canadian regulators redirected power to domestic aluminum smelters. That reduction caused real-time electricity prices in the American Northeast to climb by 87% during the first week of November. This sharp escalation demonstrates that the physical architecture of North American energy infrastructure cannot be easily re-engineered. The geographic reality is that Northern American cities rely on a continuous, just-in-time flow of Canadian energy, a structural dependency that cannot be replaced by domestic production or overseas imports within a single season. This energy dependency directly intersected with an escalating crisis in the American manufacturing core, particularly within the automotive and aerospace industries. By December, the Canadian government utilized its newly formed authority to alter the export terms of specialized aerospace-grade aluminum and battery-grade lithium from facilities in Quebec and Ontario. Under the revised framework, these materials were only cleared for export if the purchasing entity certified that the final assembly would not be subject to unilateral United States trade penalties. That requirement forced major industrial manufacturers to halt assembly lines across Michigan and Ohio, resulting in the temporary furlough of 84,000 workers. That consequence reveals that modern manufacturing is not a collection of independent national factories, but a single, deeply integrated continental machine. When one state attempts to penalize the other, it inadvertently severs its own industrial nervous system, transforming a foreign policy initiative into a domestic economic penalty. The diplomatic maneuvers executed by Ottawa concurrently extended far beyond the borders of North America, effectively isolating Washington from its traditional Western allies. While the United States administration was attempting to negotiate bilateral exemptions with individual Canadian provinces, Prime Minister Mark Carney traveled to Brussels, Tokyo, and London to sign long-term resource security pacts. These agreements locked up 65% of Canada's unallocated uranium and copper output for the next 2 decades, explicitly prioritizing nations that maintained open trading relations with Ottawa. What that diplomatic offensive achieved structurally was the permanent diversion of strategic raw materials away from the American market. Before the White House realized the supply lines were closing, it transformed a bilateral trade dispute into a global race for resource security, where the United States found itself competing against its own allies for materials extracted just a few hundred miles from its own border. The defense implications of this resource diversion became clear during a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, where senior defense officials were forced to address the impact on domestic military procurement. The Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment stated directly under questioning, "The restriction of Canadian raw material flows has disrupted our domestic production schedules for precision-guided munitions and naval reactor cores, revealing a baseline vulnerability that cannot be mitigated through short-term stockpiling." That statement reveals a deliberate choice by the defense establishment to signal its non-cooperation with the executive branch's trade policy. By placing this admission into the public congressional record, the Pentagon effectively dismantled the administration's narrative that the trade war was a manageable economic dispute. It reclassified the entire Canada strategy as an active impediment to national defense, providing the political cover that the cabinet needed to force the president's capitulation 12 hours later. The final element of the strategy was the deliberate use of institutional restraint following the White House announcement. When Prime Minister Carney delivered his 63-word response from a minimalist briefing room in Ottawa, he explicitly omitted any mention of a political victory, any reference to the American president, or any list of the concessions gained. That calculated lack of triumphalism prevented the White House from finding a political pretext to reactivate the confrontation to save face. By framing the entire 18-month trade war as a temporary period of bad weather that had simply passed, Canada allowed the executive branch to retreat without triggering an immediate domestic nationalist backlash. That restraint is an essential component of middle power statecraft, which prioritizes the permanent institutionalization of structural advantages over short-term public relations victories. The immediate crisis has concluded, and the tariffs have been removed. But the long-term structural alignment of North American commerce has been permanently altered. The Canadian Strategic Resource Authority remains active, embedded deeply within Canadian federal law, functioning as a permanent mechanism for the regulation of continental supply chains. The attention of international analysts is now shifting towards a specific upcoming event that will test whether this model of resource statecraft can be replicated globally. The key question that will determine the future balance of trade power now centers on the upcoming ministerial meeting of the International Energy Agency in Paris, where a coalition of resource exporting middle powers is scheduled to debate a unified framework for the institutional control of critical transition minerals. The operational and institutional maneuvers executed across North American supply chains over the last 18 months demonstrate that the conventional metrics of geopolitical power require a structural re-evaluation. While a traditional analysis would suggest that a smaller economy must inevitably succumb to the sustained economic pressure of a superpower, the resolution of this confrontation indicates otherwise. By shifting the conflict away from a raw test of economic scale and onto the terrain of critical resource institutionalization, Ottawa successfully converted asymmetric dependencies into a decisive strategic defense. The implications of this shift extend far beyond the immediate resolution of a bilateral trade dispute, signaling a fundamental realignment in how middle powers can counter unilateral coercion in an era of integrated global manufacturing. For Canada, the outcome represents a permanent upgrade in its sovereign leverage and a complete rewriting of its economic relationship with Washington. The establishment of the Canadian Strategic Resource Authority did not merely survive the executive branch's multi-pronged assault. It has been validated as a legitimate instrument of national security that remains active in federal law. Ottawa's next moves will likely focus on operationalizing this new structural advantage by deepening its long-term resource-pacted networks across Europe and Asia. By maintaining the CSRA as a permanent regulatory filter, Canada ensures that any future administration in Washington must treat resource security as a matter of mutual sovereign equality rather than automatic regional entitlement. This institutional reality permanently insulates the Canadian domestic market from sudden shifts in American electoral politics, establishing a precedent where strategic patience outlasted asymmetric power for the United States. The strategic retreat at the White House podium serves as a stark demonstration of the domestic limits of unilateral economic statecraft. The confrontation proved that inside a highly integrated industrial ecosystem, the deployment of aggressive tariffs behaves less like a targeted weapon and more like a systemic toxin. Washington's upcoming challenge will be managing the internal economic and political fallout from an 18-month policy that degraded its own manufacturing base, strained its domestic energy grids, and introduced unprecedented risk premiums into its supply chains. The immediate priority for American policymakers will be attempting to rebuild depleted domestic energy reserves and repairing damaged infrastructure links with northern suppliers before the peak demands of the next seasonal cycle. This experience leaves the United States with a structurally compromised bargaining position. Having exposed to the world that its critical military readiness and civilian infrastructure are fundamentally tied to external resource inputs that it cannot easily replace or coerce for. International community, particularly Western Europe, and rising economic powers like India. This confrontation provides a proven operational blueprint for middle power resilience. The long-term contracts signed with Ottawa during the height of the crisis have effectively secured vital uranium, copper, and critical mineral supply chains for these nations at the direct expense of American market access. The next phase for these global actors will involve replicating aspects of this resource-pacted model to safeguard their own industrial transition strategies against unpredictable trade actions by major powers. By aligning themselves with Canada's institutional framework, European and Asian economies have effectively decentralized the control of American commodities, diluting Washington's traditional economic hegemony in its own hemisphere. This global diversification indicates that the strategic weight in international trade is shifting away from nations that merely consume or process resources toward the nations that control their institutional extraction and export. The single most important takeaway from this 18-month economic conflict is that in a highly globalized economy, Physical size alone no longer guarantees a strategic victory. When an empire attempts to weaponize an integrated supply chain against the very neighbor that anchors its infrastructure, it activates a mechanism of self-attrition that degrades its own systemic power. Power that destroys its own alliances, workforce stability, and supply chain reliability is a power that consumes itself from within, turning an intended show of force into a public demonstration of vulnerability. In contrast, a middle power that possesses vital resources, institutional discipline, and strategic patience can effectively strip a larger adversary of its options by simply allowing the domestic costs of the conflict to accumulate until mission becomes mathematically untenable. Ultimately, this historical capitulation demonstrates that underestimating a neighbor with sovereign control over essential metals, energy grids, and maritime ports mistakes geographic scale for geopolitical control. That fundamental error in judgment cost Washington its entire economic campaign and reordered the balance of resource power in full public view.